Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about whether or not there's sex in heaven. Now before we begin, let's start with the prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Amen. So we do have a couple episodes about heaven, the 4 things that happen to you when you die, and so forth. And we have an episode on once how a pope taught that the beatific vision in heaven wasn't going to happen. And so just as an example of how popes can have bad theology, but ultimately it doesn't go against the deposit of faith or their papal infallibility. So to answer this question in the shortest way is there sex in heaven? The answer is no. And I think the best way to understand this is I did a video about what is the traditional view of marriage. And the traditional view of marriage is not marriage for the sake of being with somebody that you have a pitter-patter or you find sexually attractive or any aspect of romantic love. These are all things, I suppose, that are like a cherry on top. But the traditional view of marriage, and not just in the Catholic world or even the Christian world, but throughout all of time, regardless of what culture you look at, was all about the ordering of children. It was about children. So you'll always find some outliers, like some societies that might be matriarchal or they might practice some sort of polygamy or something like that. But you can look at every culture in the world and there was some form of marriage. And why is that? Because when a man and a woman get together, babies are going to happen, right? And so they figured out and understood like the best thing for society, for civil order, was some form of bond between the man and the woman, because when kids come from it, then we know who the parents are and that they're their primary charge. The primary, because the family would help raise them, but they're the primary ones who are raising the children. And so marriage is all about the procreation and education and rearing of children. What do we know about heaven? Some of this is gleaned from what Christ's discourse with the Sadducees, when they try to trick him and say a woman was married 7 times, all her husbands died 7 times, who is she going to be with in heaven? And he says, you're not married. There's no marriage in heaven. Now, some people hear this and they get depressed. And maybe some people hear like there's no sex in heaven and they get depressed. But understand, eyes have not seen, ears have not heard what God has ready for those who love him, right? Being in heaven is more than about satisfying, I would say, certainly the kind of low-level Maslowian hierarchy of needs. There's, even after the resurrection of the body, we're not going to be hungry or thirsty or any of these things. But it's more about being in the presence of God. And that's not to say that when you are in the beatific vision, you are not going to see loved ones who made it to heaven. Of course, if they went to hell, you're not going to see them. So theologians have talked about this. Like if you were married, let's say my parents, my father's passed away. When my mother dies, and if she goes to heaven, you will see my mother, if my father's in heaven, will see my father, and they will recognize each other. All the memories that they had on earth, they will remember. So them getting married in Guadalajara in 1962, for example, they'll remember. They'll have memories. And they'll have a certain special bond, of course. But the idea of marriage and sex, and remember, my father died at 73, my mother's 82, so the belief is that we're going to be in a perfected state. So part of a perfected state is we're probably not going to be the age that we die, whether that be you're 90 or whether or not you're 9. Okay, there's a belief in early theologians that even if you die young, or think of children that die, stillborn, aborted babies, there's going to be an age probably somewhere, I don't know, this is speculative theology, but probably somewhere between 18 and 30. So when our bodies are resurrected, we're all going to be around that kind of age in heaven. And so we're not going to be in this decrepit state of 92 years old. We'll all be relatively young. But there'll be no sex, because the whole point of sex is not unitive. Unitive is one of the goals of sex on earth. It's unitive, but it's procreative. And since we know no babies are being made in heaven, then there's no sex. there's no sex. There's no conjugal act. There's no sex at all. So there is no sex in heaven. But yes, you will recognize your loved ones, including your spouses, your siblings, your aunts, your uncles. We'll recognize them and spend time with them, but we're not going to be married because, again, marriage is a temporal or earthly institution. And all the sacraments in general are going to be wiped away in heaven because heaven is a perfected state. So we're not sinning in heaven, so there's no need for confession. We're in the presence of God, so there's no need for the Eucharist. And understand, like, one of the temptations of temporal marriage is adultery, right? So there's no sin in heaven, so there's no appetite of concupiscence in heaven, lust, lechery, whatever, anger, all these things. So there's no need for marriage in that regard because there's no worry about infidelity in any level. So in closing that, really quickly, are animals in heaven? Animals have souls, but they don't have immortal souls. So they're likely not going to be, your dog's going to be in heaven. That being said, through the power of God, he could bring your dog if that gives you pleasure. But remember, heaven is all about eternity with God. And I know it's hard for us to kind of understand that or think that's a good thing because we're so used to, I want ice cream, I want sex and all these things. But we're going to be purged of all these kind of earthly attachments in heaven. So the idea of just for eternity, being with God and being with people that we love is great. Now, are we going to be super sad if we go to heaven and our spouse is not there because they went to hell? Yes, the belief is we're going to be sad, but the sadness is outweighed by the happiness of being in heaven. And you can look at the parable of Lazarus and the poor beggar, where the Lazarus talks about it when he talks to Abraham about it. They had their opportunity. So yeah, you might be sad, but overall, people make their choices and they choose where they want to go to, and ultimately, the happiness of heaven is going to outweigh any sadness you have of loved ones not being there. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Hit the notification, subscribe, and share button. Until next time, take care. God bless and pray.